Peizazhi mediatik i Kosovës përbëhet nga dy nivele, mediat kombëtare dhe mediat rajonale. Vendi ka 19 stacione televizive operative, 86 radiostacione, 41 platforma televizive kablore dhe 97 ofertues të shërbimeve të prodhimit audio-video. Mediave në Kosovë nuk u kërkohet që të regjistrohen në mënyrë specifike si media, ato regjistrohen si subjekte afariste. Viteve të fundit, peizazhi mediatik i Kosovës është rritur, me kompani të reja mediatike që themelohen çdo vit. Ka periudha kur media të njëanshme që kanë agenda të caktuara lulëzojnë. Këto periudha përfshin kohën e zgjedhjeve, pandemisë, krizave e kështu me radhë. Këto pseudomedia themelohen me të vetmin qëllim që të ndjekin agenda të fshehta, të cilat nuk zbulohen kurrë nga audienca. Megjithatë, Kosova nuk është aq toleruese sa disa vende tjera kur bëhet fjalë për propagandën e huaj, duke përfshirë këtu edhe rajonin. Demokracitë e përparuara si Shtetet e Bashkuara zbulojnë se edukimi mediatik është zgjidhja e vetme për ta luftuar dezinformimin dhe keqinformimin që bëhet nga disa grupe të caktuara. Duke qenë kështu, Shtetet e Bashkuara kanë kontribuar jashtëzakonisht shumë në këtë çështje duke krijuar institucione, organizata, institute dhe mekanizma të tjerë për të edukuar qytetarët e saj në lidhje me konsumin e lajmeve dhe në përgjithësi mediat. Tani do të mësojmë më shumë rreth edukimit mediatik, çfarë bën, çfarë synon të bëjë dhe çfarë rezultatesh arrin. Çfarë është në të vërtetë edukimi mediatik? Si mundet shoqëria jonë t'i përvetësojë dhe të ndërmarrë veprime bazuar në këtë praktikë amerikane? Edukimi mediatik mund t'i ndihmojë qytetarët që të jenë konsumues më të mirë të lajmeve dhe t'i ndihmojë që të mësojnë se si t'i dallojnë lajmet nga dezinformimi, keqinformimi dhe propaganda. Njerëzit me mendikem të Amerikës që po merren me këtë fenomen prirën ta konsiderojnë këtë si detyrë qytetare, ndërkohë që punojnë për teknika dhe mjete për ta bërë të gjithë shoqërinë më të edukuar në lidhje me mediat. A jemi qasur shumë vonë këtij problemi? A ka ekzistuar ky problem gjatë gjithë kohës? Apo bëjmë atë që duhet për të krijuar konsumues më të mirë të lajmeve? Ku gabuam dhe si mund të korrigjohemi? A është edukimi mediatik detyrë qytetare? Për më tepër, në pyetjen tonë se cili grup është më i vështirë për të arritur në lidhje me edukimin mediatik, ne morëm përgjigje të ndryshme nga këmbvështrime të ndryshme. Kjo na bëri të besojmë se nuk ka grupe të caktuara dhe se nga edukimi mediatik do të përfitojmë të gjithë, pavarësisht nga mosha apo bindjet e tyre. Këto janë disa nga pyetjet për të cilat do t'i gjeni përgjigjet si më poshtë.
Media literacy is a civic duty. The things that protect our societies, the things that keep society free and open, the opportunities that we have that go along with that, good jobs, accountability in the health systems, all of this stuff, it depends on us having a shared set of facts. And the main way that we do that, the main institution that does that is an independent media. And the way that we keep an independent media is by having a population, communities that value independent media. And so that's the entire point of media literacy, is creating that supply and demand for independent media and the facts that they protect.
Media literacy is teaching people how to think about news and not what to think about the news. And our slogan that we really like is, we're creating a future founded on facts. In our schools, those that are really approaching media literacy in a strong way, they see media literacy as a fundamental skill to any civics education that students are getting. It's how you are one of the ways you become a responsible citizen, so that you can, one, make good choices, whether it be in the voting booth or somewhere else, but also that you are not spreading misinformation to other citizens. So it is absolutely a civic duty for people to not only become more news literate themselves, but practice news literacy in their news consumption. But having said that, I do want to say that any society that's looking to combat misinformation and disinformation, there is a role for citizens to play. However, there is a role for journalists to play too. Journalists need to be transparent in their work and let people see how they produce the news that their readers or their viewers are consuming. And when they make a mistake, be completely upfront about it and correct that mistake as quickly as possible. Without those two elements, the trust in media plummets. And if you don't have trust, it's very easy. If you don't have trust in society for something, it's very easy just to label something you don't like as fake news or disinformation, because enough people are already skeptical.
I think it's very important to develop media literacy. I think that if you're able to educate a population about media literacy, what you can do is blunt the impact of propaganda. As scholars, we know that this doesn't remove the problem altogether, because there's this phenomenon that we call the second person effect. And what this means is that if you explain to somebody about the power of propaganda or advertising or something like that, they become worried about how their neighbor will be influenced, not so much about how they themselves will be influenced. But it clearly makes things a bit better and can blunt the power of malign media, and I think eases the disruption that comes from a new media particularly.
I think understanding the function of journalism absolutely has to be a civic duty in any democracy. Children should learn about journalism just as they're learning to read. It is just as important as voting, just as important for doing any other of the duties of citizenship. Okay? A democracy can't work unless the population understands that basic concept of media literacy and how important it is for a government to function properly. It's absolutely essential.
I think it's never too early to start teaching young people how to think critically, because when we say media literacy, you could easily interchange that with critical thinking. That's really what media literacy is at its root. And I think there's a lot of media literacy starting at a little bit older of an age range, 18 to 24, when these young people are eligible to vote. I think that's too late. I think we really need comprehensive digital media literacy education at the primary grade levels, because those are truly crucial skills that young people can take with them through the remainder of their lives.
All it takes is one screw up by a journalist, and that can turn hundreds of people away from trusting news outlets forever. And that screw up might have happened, or that mess up might have happened due to a lack of understanding of media ethics. I think media ethics are so central to media literacy, because media literacy is all about teaching people how to understand the news and find trusted media sources. Media sources need to be trustworthy for that to work. For media literacy to work, we need trusted journalism outlets, which we have a ton of. And some of the best ones, they have public ethics guidelines. They have a massive amount of transparency. And those are two things that build trust in media and help improve media literacy. So I think it is the media ethics are essential to media literacy.
Media ethics and journalistic ethics is obviously extremely important, and it's one of the things that I'm sure that's part of what you would teach. In this country, they're not enforceable, realizing that every country is different, because of the First Amendment. People can say what they want to say in this country. And I think that's on balance, I'm a strong believer in that. But in countries which don't have that same requirement, you could maybe have an ethical principle that would be clearer.
I would say it began before 2016. 2016 was, to some degree, an explosion of questions of fake news and the assault on information. But it had been building for some time, frankly, I would argue for more than a decade, where with the advent of social media, 24/7 cable television, where news organizations were filling time and sometimes losing context, looping images. And citizens also, because they all have smartphones, could feel for themselves that they could create information that suited their own interests or their needs. So it started before 2016, and I think we should acknowledge that. And there were even some media literacy efforts in the United States before Pointers that began working mostly with school children to be better consumers of news and information. And it's a long, long haul to change generations, to take some responsibility for the information they got. But I think what happened is that in 2016, when certain politicians started using phrases like fake news and considering the media and news organizations the enemy, I think there was a recognition that more and more had to be done to empower citizens to take some ownership of the information and the quality of the information that they were getting so that they could make better decisions for themselves.
Without media literacy, Kosovo's democracy simply will not work. So this show that you're doing, the work of the media, we have a close cooperation with AGK here in Kosovo, working with that. We're working with political parties, with the parliament, trying to make sure that everyone understands the importance of fact-checking. This is a global challenge, and Kosovo's more wired than other countries, but it still faces the exact same challenges. So it's particularly throughout this region, we face a lot of Chinese and particularly Russian disinformation, which really just comes straight from Moscow and into the markets here. Sputnik is openly just selling disinformation. And what that is doing, it's part of President Putin's effort to destabilize not just my country, the United States, but also Kosovo and the Western Balkans by sowing anti-Western, anti-democratic narratives. And our polls show that some of those feelings of autocracy, authoritarianism, are seeping into Kosovo's youth. Some of our youth, under certain circumstances, it's okay to censor the media. It's okay to infringe on human rights. That's the roots of authoritarianism setting foot even here among the youth in Kosovo. So I think the alarm bells should be off, and media literacy has to begin now and at a very early age. And it's everyone's civic duty. Democracy won't work without it.
Or is really the problem that we've never developed the healthy public routines? I mean, I think, every time I talk to someone about media literacy and I say, do you as a human being consume media in the same way your parents did? And the answer is always no. Do your parents, if they're alive, still consume media the same way they did when they were your age? The answer is no. What have we done as a thoughtful intervention to change how you or your parents or your kids consume news? And the last analogy I'll give for this is, I actually think rather than starting with fake news, starting with the diet metaphor is so powerful. We're at a similar inflection point where some people still live on a farm and their farm to table is quite literal. And some people still live in a world where they get their news from their local community of word to mouth. That's true anywhere in the world. Most of us live in a world of agricultural, big agriculture, where we don't see our food until it's on our table. We also don't see our news produced until it's on our table.
Përderisa në Shtetet e Bashkuara janë krijuar shumë programe për t'i edukuar qytetarët për konsumin e mediave dhe lajmeve, ka ende vende si Kosova që nuk i kanë të njohur ato teknika dhe mjete. Shumë programe kanë demonstruar se janë produktive dhe të suksesshme në Shtetet e Bashkuara, si projekti i edukimit mediatik, programi Axios, Instituti Pointer dhe degët e tij dhe shumë të tjera. Për të kuptuar më mirë se çfarë është bërë deri tani, si është trajtuar kjo temë dhe çfarë duhet bërë në vijim, ndeshni elaborimin në vijim. Duhet përmendur se Kosova ka ende rrugë të gjatë për të bërë drejtpërfshirjes së praktikave të tilla të avancuara, sepse nëse jo asgjë mund të thuhet se është bërë shumë pak në këtë drejtim.
So the News Literacy Project is a national, nonpartisan nonprofit here in the United States. And since 2008, we have helped teachers teach their students how to become more discerning consumers of news, how to tell truth from fiction, how to become critical of the news they read, but not cynical of the news that they read. And we've been doing that now for 14 years, and starting this year, we're actually beginning to do work with the general public as well, because while we need to prepare the next generation of our voters to be news literate, we have generations of current voters who were never taught these skills and are currently really struggling with the amount of misinformation and disinformation that they see online, and what to make of it, and how to sort the fact from the fiction in the news that they're reading.
Information about what's going on in the world around them, that's what the DFR Lab kind of looks at. And so whether it's how certain narratives spread across an information environment from platform to platform, right? If something pops up on Facebook and then it's reported by media, or the other way around. We look at the nuts and the bolts of that. We look at that, how that kind of all comes together. And we look at that in order to find where there's discrepancies or falsehoods or harms to what we would call the shared set of facts that democracy depends on. And for us, that's really, really important, because that kind of gets away from like why media matters, or it might sound like it gets away from why media matters, but a shared set of facts that democracy depends on, media is essential, independent media is essential to making sure that that exists. And why does a shared set of facts mean so much for democracy? It's existential. Without a shared set of facts, how do we come together as citizens to make decisions that are, huge for each one of our communities, our countries?
Pointer is an institute that works with professional journalists around the world to elevate the craft of journalism, their ethics, their journalists' ethics, storytelling, reporting, digital work, leadership, in the belief that better journalism is good for democracy and good for citizens. In the last 5 years, we have expanded that work to include not only teaching professional journalists, but also as basically a headquarters for fact-checking in the United States with PolitiFact, which is owned by Pointer and is the largest political independent fact-checking organization in the United States. We are also home to the International Fact-Checking Network, which supports fact-checkers around the globe to ensure quality fact-checking and independent journalism and independent fact-checking around the globe. And we are home to MediaWise as well. MediaWise is our media literacy program that is working also around the globe now to work with everything from middle school, elementary school children, all the way to senior citizens to help them be literate and figure out for themselves the difference between fact and fiction online.
We work with journalists to demonstrate what makes their information credible. We remind them that there is plenty of irresponsible information out there, and that as a news consumer, it's genuinely very confusing to figure out what to trust and what not to trust. So if a headline from a reputable TV station, newspaper, radio station shows up in somebody's social media feed or is on the TV at the gym next to irresponsible information, it is genuinely very difficult to tell which is which. So we advise journalists to empathize with that and to acknowledge that there is a lot of irresponsible information in the world, and to say, but here is what makes our work credible. Here is why we invite you to consume our information in a way that makes you comfortable with what we're sharing.
One of the things that's really important is that mis and disinformation now is global. It's a globalized thing thanks to technology, and so it's good to network with other fact-checking units outside of your country so that you can stay abreast of misinformation, disinformation from the start. One of the things that the IFCN has helped spearhead is different innovations. So we did the Coronavirus Facts Alliance, where our fact-checking units across the globe shared common mis and disinformation that was coming out about coronavirus. Recently, we've done the same thing with Ukraine Fact Alliance. That was spearheaded by Maldita.es, which is a fact-checking unit in Spain. And they helped share mis and disinformation, because the more units that can verify it, or debunk it, the greater that impact is. And impact is really important in fact-checking. The other thing is staying abreast of social media and knowing where people are getting that information from. In some countries, Twitter is really prominent. In the US, Twitter is very, very prominent. In other countries, Facebook is the more prominent social media. I think that's true of a lot of countries. And then also targeting different demographics. For example, in the United States, we target Instagram and TikTok to try and debunk mis and disinformation, because that's where young people are. They're not on Facebook anymore. And just being aware that all demographics share mis and disinformation. It's not just young people, and it's not just old people, it's them and everybody in between. And so being aware of where misinformation comes from and knowing to check it is pretty vitally important. But again, I think I think being aware that mis and disinformation is a global issue and that misinformation, it's not restricted by border.
Politicians will say just about anything to try to get elected. That's a worldwide phenomenon, I'm sure. And what we saw is that there were, in journalism in the United States, there was a fear or hesitancy to say that politician is not telling the truth. They're lying. Or they're saying something that's half true. And we thought that people, citizens, voters, needed to know what was true and what was not. And this was exacerbated because of the situation of the internet. We thought at that time in 2007 that citizens did not have the ability to properly understand what was true and what was not on the internet. And so they needed sources of information that they could go to get the right information. Starting in 2007 was, we would let you know if your politician was telling you the truth or not, right? Holding them accountable. So we've been around for 15 years now. We have published more than 23,000 fact checks, and we have expanded to cover lots of different things. So now, while we started only fact-checking politicians, now we fact-check members of the media. We fact-check online posts, viral images, memes, videos, people on TV, people on talk radio, newspapers. Basically, any piece of content that you can see or find is something that we think we can fact check.
We have an inbox at Axios, news@axios.com. It comes to me. It's where people send complaints or ask for corrections. And oftentimes people email me and say things like, oh, you're fake news, you're stupid, why are you even doing this? And then I ask them, what do you read? Who do you trust? And there was an example yesterday where someone wrote back and said, well, I read the New York Times and I read the Wall Street Journal. I'm also a big fan of the Epoch Times. The Epoch Times is a news organization started by Falun Gong, the Chinese organization, which is not fact-based. They do a lot of real news, but they also do a lot of misrepresented news. And I emailed the person back, because you need to be a little smarter about this. And I sent them something from an organization called NewsGuard, which does audits of news organizations in the United States to determine where they get their funding from, who runs it, if they're honest or not. I told this person, you should pay more attention to this, because you're reading this and you think, oh, this is just like the Washington Post. It's not. And I think that's the challenge in media literacy, is that it's very difficult for people to tell the difference between that.
So what we teach at MediaWise is the ability to identify keywords when you are reading it, because most trustworthy journalism outlets will have the story marked as either an opinion or a column or an op-ed or an editorial. So we teach teens all of those words, how to be on the lookout for it. But we also teach them the signs of a strong news story, lots of links and sources within the story, quotes from experts, original reporting. So we try to teach teens, and really everyone now, how to identify a solid news story versus an opinion piece that might mislead in a way.
Si që përmend nga zotri Mehedëvan, mos diferencimi lajmeve informative dhe opinioneve të shpërndara në media është bërë problem. Konsiderohet se është e vështirë për të mos thënë e pamundur që qytetarët të bëjnë dallimin mes lajmit dhe opinionit. Për më tepër, konsumuesit klasik të lajmeve priren të ndjekin burimet e tyre prej nga e marrin informacionin. Këto burime mund të ndjekin agjendat e caktuara, ose interesa që i plotësojnë interesat e këtyre konsumuesve dhe pikërisht atëherë shfaqet ky problem. Për të kuptuar më mirë ndryshimin, ne kemi elaboruar edhe më tej këtë çështje.
Journalists understand how journalists do journalism, right? And where we struggle is explaining how that works to our readers. Something we think about a lot since the founding of Axios 5 years ago is how to be very much more transparent in how we know things and how we do things, and letting the personalities and expertise of our reporters shine through. There's something I think a lot in the United States is how we have opinion pages and then we have news pages, and all journalists know that they're different, but no readers think like that. Only people in journalism schools think like that. And so I think it's very important to be more emphatic about those distinctions and how those things work, because of the threats to journalism and to journalists, not just in the United States, but around the world now.
I think it's in the interest of all journalists to help people understand the difference. one of the things that I think there's a conversation that's ongoing about is what is the terminology that we journalists use to describe our work, and how does that translate to the public? When we talk about what's an article and what's a column and what's an opinion and what's commentary, those are terms that don't necessarily resonate with the public. They sometimes have difficulty distinguishing, and we forget that is often what we call in the US jargon, right? That's really just sort of common to our industry. So that's one of the reasons why we advocate for newspapers, news organizations, being as transparent about their work as possible, explaining to people the difference, labeling content when necessary so that people can tell what is opinion and what is a fact-based article.
Opinion writers very often don't lay out a rational fact-based, a factually based basis for their opinions. They just assume, and very often correctly, that the reader already agrees with the basic premise, and they just give them sort of reassurances that their particular attitude is correct. Okay, that's what non-professionals and propagandists would do. But a professional journalist wouldn't do that, because a professional journalist has been trained not only to make suggestions for how to deal with this issue, they also are required to bring in alternatives from the other side. Yeah, I teach opinion writing, and I absolutely, unequivocally require you must bring in some of the other side to show the reader that you have assessed both sides, and by laying out the facts and applying rational thought, you reach this decision. But you reach that decision after considering the other side. Okay, propagandists will virtually never consider the other side except to criticize it. Okay, and that is very often referred to as fake news.
Verifikimi i autorëve, siç rekomandohet nga profesor Watson, është diçka që aplikohet nga studentët e gazetarisë. Për më shumë, studentët kanë ndarë me ne teknika dhe metoda të tjera që i kanë mësuar gjatë studimeve, dhe të cilat i zbatojnë në jetën e tyre të përditshme për verifikimin e fakteve si dhe perceptimin e tyre në rrjetet sociale.
In the media-wise virtual trainings that we always have like a set of like fact-checking tools and tips. And there's always one tip that I feel can be used in almost every situation, in almost every context, with every kind of post. And it's called reading upstream. So for example, you see any kind of media, so a picture, like a photo, video, article, or basically any type of media. And the concept behind reading upstream is to sort of find the original source of that piece of media.
The three questions that the fact checkers pose are: who's behind the information, what's the evidence, and what do other sources say? So we have to consider the source, evaluate the evidence, consult multiple sources, which we all should be doing, not just reading one source or two sources for news, and read laterally. Open up the tabs to see what other trustworthy sources have to say about the information, particularly if we're not familiar with the website. And use click restraint. That is, when you Google something, when you search for something, you have to resist the urge to look at the first thing that comes up, or the second, or the third, and instead check what the titles are, look at the URLs, and look at the snippets. Usually the first few things that come up in the search are advertisements. It's sponsored content, and we don't want to be clicking that on. And also check nonpartisan fact-checking sites.
Everyone right now is capable of being a journalist. Everyone right now is capable of producing the media. And I think this contributes to the expansion of what we're talking about, misinformation and fake news. And it also, what I believe is the audience right now is, we are in a way more fast-paced environment where people go to social media for their news for their news just by reading the sensationalist titles, which is sometimes all they need.
One thing that I saw recently in the past several years is Facebook, Twitter implementing these sort of structures where they do this kind of fact checking, and be that it may be marginally a good idea, but like you have to understand that these companies have incentives for fact checking certain pieces of information. And there's always going to be monetary incentives for these large corporations. They are not neutral arbiters of truth. And I think what you were saying before about each individual person being responsible for understanding how to digest information is going to be vital.
As we're going into a new landscape and journalists are having to adapt and take advantage of social media even more, I think it's so important that journalists aren't afraid of the social media space, because in addition to everything that everyone else has mentioned, there's also the fact that when you're reading an article, you don't really have the same ability to participate in the news that you might get from reading a Facebook post where you can comment, where you can like, where you can share. So if journalists jump into that and embrace that aspect of social media, knowing that it has its risks and downsides as well, I think it can sort of strengthen the stories that we're sharing.
Edhe pse ka ende shumë punë për të bërë në këtë drejtim dhe suksesi vërtet do të arrihet kur secili qytetar i botës të kuptojë qëllimin e edukimit mediatik. Janë ndërmarrë iniciativa të mëdha për të ndihmuar qytetarët për të përvetësuar këto praktika. Kjo nuk është iniciativa e parë e Kosovës për ta përvetësuar edukimin mediatik, nga e cila do të përfitonin qytetarët e saj, por vlerësohet se edukimi mediatik është ende term i panjohur për shumicën dhe se ne jemi vetëm fillestar në këtë çështje. Kur shikojmë anën e ndritur e kemi një shembull të shkëlqyer për ta ndjekur. Se çfarë duhet bërë dhe si duhet bërë, shtjellohet nga disa prej aktorëve më të rëndësishëm në këtë fushë, jo vetëm në SBA, por në mbar botën.
Two basic steps require media literacy as part of basic, you say elementary school for children 5, 7, 9. Start it there and make sure it continues in some form all the way through the beginning of university. Okay. On the professional side, you should require schools of journalism to focus on accuracy, the idea of serving the public interest, and professional skepticism. That no matter who's in charge, you can't be a supporter, not an antagonist, but a skeptic. If the government says this, you don't necessarily print that as fact. You say the government said this, and as a skeptic, you may be aware of something that indicates that may not be true or that may not be the best policy. You have an obligation as you work in the public interest to bring that out. Not because you don't like that particular politician, but because it is your duty to be skeptical, because that's how you best serve the public.
We've got to make that a little bit easier for people. And there are structural things that we can do, right? From a policy standpoint, things that the social media platforms where these information environments live now can do, what our governments need to be doing in terms of governing this space, what media needs to do, or how media needs to exist and be protected in particular. And then frankly, this is, whether everything that you see on the internet is false, it feels like a really, really confusing and scary thing. And what we've got to do for that is make it, again, easier for people in their day-to-day lives to say, okay, well, I'm looking at this on my social media feeds, or I'm looking at this on the media outlet's website, or I'm seeing this on TV, and I can trust this because this, and that. Or, I'm a little bit skeptical of what I'm seeing here for these reasons. And that's what we talk about when we're talking about media resilience or media literacy. But what it is it's building a more resilient ecosystem. So that way, when there's one falsehood, it doesn't have an impact on the entire kind of ecosystem. Or when there's one, little bit of untruth, we can figure out what the truth is.
I'd say the most important skill for young people, if they're trying to learn more about misinformation and think critically about the types of content that they're seeing online, would be to always question who is behind the information. Answering that question will let you know a lot of things. Are they biased? Do they have something to gain from you believing this information? Or do they have something to gain from you sharing this information with your own followers? So I would say always starting with who posted this, check out their bio. Are they a legitimate expert? Are they verified? Obviously, a verified account doesn't mean something is true, but it could indicate if they are a reputable source in the things that you're looking into. So starting with who posted the content, I think would be the foundation for all media literacy education moving forward.
I think the key there is, again, the fact-checking, but also financial transparency. If someone is paying for a boost on Facebook or opening up a portal, who's paying for that? And that would solve a lot of the problems if you had financial transparency about who is behind these portals. You see this all through elections. All of a sudden these portals pop up and fan pages and things like that, but there's money behind all of that. So let's make it transparent so that you can have free speech, but purchasing of ads and engagement in the political sphere, the financing of that really needs to be public.
Does it sound real? Like, if it sounds like it's not credible, click on another link. Like, do your research. Look at whether or not there's legitimacy behind this. Look at what the sourcing is. You should always look at where the source of something is from. And I think that's just a really basic, fundamental media literacy step, is just do a gut check.
You have, as an app on your phone, an application, where you're reminded of what are the questions, what are you seeing? You put up your phone to this information you're seeing and it brings back questions you should be asking. It doesn't have to be high tech. It really is quite simple, because the questions you should be asking about what you're seeing are actually really simple. It's about, what are the power structures behind this thing I'm watching? Who made the decisions? What are you seeing? What are you not seeing? And what does it mean to me? Why do I care? Why should I care? Like, literally, it can be a few questions, and it gets kids to think.
I think any way you can get it done, do that, right? Like, if I think about as I think about the laws regarding media and the understanding of media in the United States, like, I learned about that, like, in my law classes, like when I was in college, constitutional law. That's when I learned the boundaries about what are the restrictions on the press in the United States. Any way you can learn it, I think, is great. So I'm dodging your question here, just to say, like, I don't know if you can get it, get it. Don't worry too much about the mechanics of it. It's just that it's such a useful topic that is so easily lost in the speed of technological change. Any way you can have a conversation about it. And a conversation about it, I think, is very important. In 2016, the idea of disinformation or like Russian spam bots on Twitter, no one thought about that in the United States. And then we lived through an election, and we've lived through the last 4 years, and now we're seeing what's happening in Europe with Ukraine and Russia. And I think just as a populace, we have a slightly more nuanced understanding about how information works on the internet. And so we're maybe learning it the hard way, at least we're learning it.